Y'all ready for this one? It's time. It's rapid fire. 32 bars of fire, part 5. Let's get it. All praise to my Lord and my Savior, Jesus Christ.
Walk with a brand new break, we stand true. Been it ever breaking just like I'm bamboo. There ain't nothing that my guy can't do. Following the Peter, jump with the moon Andrew. Represent the Holy One, the middle of the one. But another Jimmy Finnan, I keep running the one. He gave up his only son. Look at the back of the book, you know we won. Never distracted, running galactic. Everything we got to the world impacting. The word of his sheep will never set on the feet. He's on my feet with that anaphylactic shock and awe. He's an awesome God. Remember Daniel Langs did locking jaws. Digging away coming straight up out of Arkansas. Holy Ghost on the move is a phenomenon.
You came from
Still repping Christ. Dead come to life. Get it on momentum and we're gonna get it when we're gonna the freedom when we get it with a bar. Still repping Christ. Dead come to life. Get it on momentum and we're gonna get it when we're gonna the freedom when we get it with a bar. Still repping Christ. Dead come to life. Get it on momentum and we're gonna get it when we get it with the freedom when we get it with a bar. Still repping Christ. All praise to the Messiah. Get it on momentum and we're gonna get it when we get it with the freedom with the rapid fire.
All right, here we are with Reverend Ron's Revelation Room, Season 2, Episode 3. And I'm here with Philip, and I've never heard your last name, so I can't pronounce it.
It's Cottraux.
Okay, that's what I would have said.
Yeah, exactly. You just call me Phil, it's fine.
Yep. So here we're here with Phil, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion here. If you'll just introduce yourself, Phil, for all those who have unfortunately missed your presence.
Okay. Well, my name is Philip Cottraux, and you're all not seeing in double tonight. The way you can tell the difference between me and Ron is he has a hat on. So, but I do consider him my brother from another mother. So I run a blog. It's depthsofpentecost.com. I was a Sunday school teacher at my church for 10 years. And I also have a book out, which I'm going to probably denounce some of what I said in my book tonight. So that's going to be really interesting. I also have a second book that I'm working on. It's almost done. So I blog about the Bible, about Christian apologetics, about history, philosophy, a little bit of science. Every now and then I'll go off on a weird subject, like I've blogged about the history behind the ancient aliens conspiracy theory. I'm really attracted to weird stuff. That's just my personality. I'm into odd things. But the blog was very Pentecostal biased when I started. I think I started it back in 2015. So because I was a Sunday school teacher, it was kind of a catch up on my Sunday school classes for the people that missed it, who weren't there. So from there, it turned into its own thing. It just kind of grew, and I got more ideas. Oh, I want to write about this. I want to write about this. And my earlier blogs, like if you go back and read them, they're kind of very fire and brimstone and sinners repent and very old timey preacher type stuff. And I still write stuff like that occasionally, but the blog has evolved and changed over the years, and I've incorporated more of my own interest in there. So, you know, I'll write about biblical archaeology, basically anything that's kind of related to God or the Bible or Christianity or religion. And even if you set aside my bias as a Christian, which I admit that I do have, like, I think religion is just a really interesting topic. And I think about, does God exist? Why do people believe in God? Why do we have religious ceremonies? You know, where did all this come from in the human mind? And how is it, you know, how has it manifested itself throughout history? I just really find that stuff interesting and love to write about it and research it. I don't claim to be an expert in anything. I know you had Adam Tippett on a few weeks ago. He is an actual expert. I am not. I am totally an amateur at biblical scholarship and apologetics and all that. So I've been wrong about a lot of things. I've had to go back and correct a lot of blogs and things like that. So I'm perfectly willing to admit that.
Well, you and I share a lot in that realm. I know quite a bit about a lot of the topics, but I'm no expert in anything.
I'm kind of like a jack of all trades, but a master of none. I'm the type of guy who I get really, really obsessively interested in things, and it's usually things that are totally out there, like dinosaurs and astronomy and philosophy. And when I'm interested in something, I will go all in. I will obsessively study and read it and everything about it. But I don't have a degree in any of that stuff. I'm totally a self-taught kind of person. So
yeah, that autodidactic person.
That's the word. That's the word.
Yeah, that's the way I am, and it's awesome. I love learning, and I love studying things. I love that stuff. But one of the problems of being an autodidact is that you don't know what you don't know. So you can miss some things at the very beginning, like the basics of a topic, and that's where the value of a formal education really comes in.
Yeah,
because like I said, it sounds stupid. You don't know what you don't know, and a lot of times as an autodidact, you can miss some of that. Stuff.
Well, and it's always good to read books by experts, like read books by people who know what they are talking about, and that's a lesson I've learned the hard way a few times.
Yeah, and for me, whenever I try to, especially a skill, but whenever I try to learn something, I never tire of the beginner stuff because, like, I work as a carpenter, or at least I work with carpenters, but I'll constantly like when I'm driving to and from work, I'll listen to either I'll switch between music and Bible study or academic article or a audio book. And even to this day, I've been doing carpentry as a job for over 2 years, and I'll still pull up basic carpentry stuff on YouTube, and usually I can find one nugget in there that I can learn. But so I love learning. You probably have done it a little more than me on a lot of this stuff, especially the Exodus. I'm aware of it, but I haven't written a book, even one I have to renounce. But, so I guess we'll start there, because you wrote a book that you've self-published, right? I think you self-published it, didn't you?
Sort of.
So
the book started. It's called Bringing the Exodus to Life, and I've been on S.J. Thomason's channel talking about it as well. So it started off as, it was really just a ordinary Bible study I was doing on the Exodus, and then I kept finding more things and more things. And I've always wanted to write a book. Being an author is kind of like a dream I've had ever since a child. So I go back and I watched this movie called Exodus: Patterns of Evidence on Netflix, and I was completely wowed by it, because I was new to the subject of Bible archaeology. So I was like, wow, there really is evidence for the Exodus, and it happened during the late or during the Middle Bronze Age in 1440 something BC. And the reason archaeologists say that it didn't happen is because they're looking at the wrong time period, and there's no evidence of it during the reign of Ramses the Great. So from there, I ordered David Roll's books, and Roll has a whole volume of books on this, and I was going back over them and was like, wow, this is amazing, because this was all new stuff to me, and I didn't realize that it actually was, a lot of it's incorrect, to put it mildly. So I wrote my own book, and I used David Roll's revised chronology of Egypt, and I argued for a 1447 date for the Exodus, and I got the book published, and as soon as that happened, I started getting doubts, and I'm like, so the YouTube channel, David Falk's channel, the Ark of the Covenant, that's the name of his book, the Ancient Egypt in the Bible.
Yeah.
I started watching that, and at first I was skeptical. I was like, I've got all my David Roll's books. He's not going to debunk David Roll. He's not going to argue for the new kingdom. I'm armed and prepared to debunk all this stuff. And the opposite ended up happening. I saw holes and problems in David Roll's revised chronology of Egypt, and I started realizing that the Exodus could not have happened in the mid-15th century BC. It really had to have happened in the mid-13th century, probably most likely under the reign of Ramses the Great. So a lot of people have told me since then, I've come out and written more blogs sort of recanting my book and disavowing it and explaining I just finished a series. It started with why I think the Torah. You can argue that the Torah was written not during the Babylonian exile, but earlier than that, during the late Bronze Age in Egypt. There's just all sorts of tells in the text. And from there, that just launched a whole new series of the archaeological evidence for the Exodus, the origins of the Torah, and then I just finished publishing last week on my website the archaeological evidence for the conquest. So I feel like that was very cathartic for me to go back and kind of set myself straight on a lot of things.
Yeah. I watched that patterns for evidence for the 15th century date, and I found it convincing too.
Mm-hmm.
And really, Dr. Falk's channel changed my mind, but not just Dr. Falk. I started reading Dr. Walton too.
Oh yeah. John Walton.
Yeah, and I started seeing the evidence for the Egyptian influence in the Torah.
Right.
And I found it very compelling, especially from Walton's writing, how the Ark of the Covenant has a lot of Egyptian influence in it, and the early books of the Torah, or all the books of the Torah, have a lot of Egyptian influence in it. And you mentioned that on your blog too. And Dr. Falk brings that up. And is the Egypt, and our friend Adam Tippett, he's big. He believes in or buys into that idea as well, and he's helped me a lot. He pointed me in a lot of correct
he
good
helped
directions.
Me too. He proofread and went over the blogs before I published them to make sure there weren't any mistakes in it. So I learned a lesson from the book is like have an expert review your work before you publish it and put it out there to save yourself a lot of future embarrassment. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised with myself because most of the things he found wrong that I had to change were just like you spelled Neferti wrong or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is I appreciate Dr. Falk's channel, and of course he's not the only Egyptologist I've interacted his work I've interacted with, but one of the things that we run afoul of often is there's a difference in scholarship between fringe scholarship and a minority position scholarship.
Yes.
Just because something's not in the consensus or is in a minority position doesn't mean it's invalid scholarship. But often we hear that charge. I've even seen people make that charge against Dr. Falk. But there's a difference between fringe scholarship and a minority position. Yeah,
and when it comes to that, the real question I have, because I agree with you, is who's making the best case? Like, you know, when people have dismissed Dr. Falk, it's basically because they've said, well, he's not in the majority position. And to me, it's like, but minority positions are still valid. And the question is, where does the evidence really lead? And the evidence, to me, it seems to be growing, pointing towards Dr. Falk's model for the Exodus and when it happened. And I suspect eventually biblical minimalism will be a minority position itself, because there seem to be more and more biblical maximalists that believe in the historical reliability of the Torah. That seems to be a growing position. So, now as far as fringe scholarship goes, this is something this was a valuable lesson for me. So any scholar that says something that almost no other scholars take seriously, but then presents himself as a martyr or as a persecuted hero, that's one of your biggest tells that they're a con man. And so David Rohl does that. Nobody takes his revised chronology seriously. So what he does is he goes and he packages it to the layman, the people who don't know better. So he sells his books to, just ordinary Christians and Jews like me. And the result is, he's sort of playing them, but he's able to really suck them in as a reader and say, but this is the idea that is too dangerous for the mainstream academia. And so I'm seeing over and over again, like, if anybody who claims to be a scholar, even if they've got like a degree, if they do that, run. Like, don't listen to what they say. And obviously, our quintessential example as Christians is Richard Carrier, with his ideas about Jesus mythicism and well, you know what they are. I'm not going to say them. That's an example of a fringe scholar. So he may have a PhD, but if nobody in the academic community takes him seriously, then you shouldn't either.
And that's always a red flag. And unfortunately, you see a lot of pro-Christian videos on YouTube and stuff, and they're like, here's the dangerous secret information nobody wants to tell you about the Bible here, especially like numerology stuff. But it's like every time I hear that, it's like red flag, and I'm going to turn this off.
And like, it makes a compelling story because people love underdog stories, and we love to root for heroes who are persecuted. So if somebody's not taken seriously by the academic community, they can get popularity and readership and money from book sales by presenting that story of themselves to the public.
Yeah. And it's very unfortunate because you got well-meaning, like, believers, Christians, who get sucked into that. And it's not that they're incurious or anti-intellectual, but they're being misled by this, this fringe or complete made-up scholarship that kind of passes an eyeball test if you're not really aware of what's going on.
And really, the hilarious part is that fringe scholars will say things like, I'm the hero, I'm being suppressed, and the academia is trying to keep this away from me because it's dangerous ideas. Look, that stuff is what sells the most. Like, the Da Vinci Code books, they kind of take the same path. Or Graham Hancock with the Lost City of Atlantis. Like, that stuff's all crackpot, but the public eats it up. So, if an actual academic professor publishes a real paper that's respected, nobody cares. It's boring to read. Like, the general public doesn't really get into that. It doesn't sell the exciting, scandalous story.
But SJ makes a great point about the History Channel. I've really learned recently since I've started. Since I've become a believer and started looking into biblical archaeology and biblical scholarship, there's a lot that the History Channel gets completely wrong.
I don't even...
And it's because they're trying to sell a program.
They are, and if you haven't read it, I'm going to plug my blog here for the viewers. If you go to my website and go to the archives page, a few months ago, I wrote a blog series on the origins of the ancient aliens thing, and it's really, really dark. People either think it's crazy or it's a funny idea, but it actually originated in Nazi Germany, and there's white supremacist Nazi ideology behind both the lost city of Atlantis and the ancient aliens hypotheses. And it is rooted in scientific racism. And it's actually really ugly, dark stuff that we should not be promoting or going anywhere near.
Yeah. Well, I can see that happening because certainly they're not going to give any credit to Middle Easterners or Jews.
Yeah.
As far as ancient accomplishments.
And it's one of the strangest things, and I brought this up in the blog, that the guy who made Ancient Aliens popular, Eric von Daniken, has some white supremacist ideology. And it's the strangest thing to me that in today's climate, when everyone is so sensitive about you can get canceled for racist comments or anytime you've said anything insensitive in the past, this guy... His book was edited by a Nazi. The original book, Chariots of the God, the head editor was a Nazi. And Eric von Daniken has made white supremacist comments before. And it's like, he's still working as the producer of Ancient Aliens, and that show is still on the air.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean,
I
I don't
didn't
know.
know
It
that.
may have been, it
Well,
may have went through its last season, but as far as I know, it is. I mean, it just still continues, and
I,
I'm like, yeah, open your eyes, people. This stuff is actually racist and Nazi in origin.
and but you see that a lot in scientific. One of the points you were making, you see that a lot with scientific studies,
Yeah,
especially psychology is a real big one. Is like
yeah,
whenever there's a study that proves something you wouldn't have expected, some outlier idea, and
yeah,
then it gets all the press, and then ends up being not correct. I mean,
yeah,
it's the fancy, flashy headline stuff that gets all the press, and especially in scientific studies, it's almost never like
yeah.
the
Yeah,
case.
that's a whole other subject in and of itself, how the
Yeah,
media misrepresents scientific studies. So whenever I see anything
yeah,
like a news headline that says something like, we've now discovered that the Big Bang didn't really happen, or new scientific evidence shows a new fundamental force of physics, I don't get excited. I just sort of wait back and I'm like, let this sit for a few days, hear what some other experts have to say. Maybe Sarah Salviander will weigh in on it and set us all straight about what this is really about.
yeah. Well, a lot of
We
times,
live in
if
a
you,
clickbaity
uh-huh.
media time, like the stuff that gets a lot of clickbait, and there's no way it's monitored. I mean, nobody can really like carefully cultivate true, accurate information.
Well, and a lot of times, even those stories, they bury the lead.
Yeah,
It's got the popping headline, and you read it, and it's like maybe, possibly, sort of, kind of. This is what we're looking at,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and so yeah, and unfortunately, that stuff does sell books. It sells clicks, and
yeah.
well, I guess we'll get back to the Exodus again because
Okay.
uh, you will hear a lot of people, especially atheists, say there's zero evidence for the Exodus,
Yeah.
and academia has had as a prevalent idea biblical minimalism
Mm-hmm.
for many years now, a couple of decades
Yeah.
probably,
Yeah.
at least a couple of decades, I would think. But yes, biblical maximalism is actually on the rise,
Yeah.
and we've got good evidence. You brought this up in your latest blog, but one of the problems with archaeological evidence in the Middle East is, for one, we're talking ancient. We're talking
Yeah.
ancient, or before Rome, well before Rome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And evidence doesn't survive in the Middle East.
That's true.
Physical evidence.
Yeah.
I would never expect us to find much physical evidence of the actual Exodus itself, or where Moses would have split the rock or whatever.
Yeah.
That stuff just doesn't survive.
Yeah. Yeah, and like there's a lot of pseudo archaeology that circulates on the internet with like doctored photos like, look, this is a rock that's been split down the middle in the Sinai Peninsula. This is the rock Moses struck. Or look, we found evidence of chariot wheels on the bottom of the Red Sea. Like that stuff's almost always fake.
Yeah.
For that reason, for what you just said.
But we do have solid evidence
Yeah.
in lending itself to especially the Ramsite dating of the Exodus.
So there's really no question. The first step about the Exodus, were there Semites in Egypt? And the answer, that's not even controversial. I mean, that's a consensus, yes. And we know
especially
that
around the Hyksos reign, right?
right. And up before that, I mean, Semitic people were migrating to that region of Egypt for a long time. And they did build a city called Avaris, and Avaris did become a bustling metropolis that was very wealthy. And so the Hyksos reign was the time after the 13th dynasty of Egypt failed. Then there was nobody to rule Egypt at the time. So the Hyksos, who were these wealthy Semites, just said, well, why don't we rule? So they just sort of took control. And it was originally thought that the Hyksos were violent invaders, that they were conquerors who came with swords, because that's how they're described by the Egyptian priest historian Manetho. But we now know that that's probably propaganda. So the Egyptians were very xenophobic. They hated foreigners. They really hated Semites, people who sacrificed, goats and sheep and things like that. They just, they worshipped animals, so they didn't understand that kind of thing. So they hated the Semitic presence. They hated it even more when those Semites started to rule over them. And so that occurs during Egypt's second intermediate period. And that's what we today call the Hyksos. And the Joseph story fits very well into that context because there's really no other time in history where a pharaoh of Egypt would have appointed a Semitic traveler to be the Grand Vizier and second in command over Egypt. But there's other things too. There's a lot of tells in the story. I don't think I could go over them all, but I can recommend some books to read on this, like James Hoffmeyer's Israel in Egypt. There's a lot of tells in the Joseph story that place it in the context of the Hyksos reign during the second intermediate period. Yeah. And from there, we know that after the Hyksos were overthrown and thrown out and driven out, they were mostly slaughtered and exterminated. There was a population of them that remained in Avaris that were enslaved, because we read about in the biography of Ahmose, who founded the 18th dynasty. So we know that Avaris was habited by Semitic people who were enslaved. And then the city was very suddenly abandoned and evacuated basically overnight. Now, is that the historical biblical Exodus? We can't say for certain, but probably. I mean, there's a very strong case to make that it was. We have a lot of indirect evidence within the Torah itself. So, for example, biblical minimalism says that the Torah was authored during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, when the Jews were in exile in Babylon. They were inventing this fictitious story to inspire national pride, to unify an effort to get released back to their homeland. But the problem is there aren't any old Iranian loanwords in the Torah, but there's a high concentration of Egyptian loanwords that can be dated specifically to New Kingdom era of Egypt. So it really makes more sense that the Torah was actually authored in Egypt. So for example, at the crossing of the Red Sea, the term Red Sea in original Hebrew was Reed Sea, and that word is Yam Suf. Well, the Egyptian word Juf is the word for sea. They called it the Pod Juf, the Sea of Reeds, and so that Juf is a Egyptian loanword that found itself in Hebrew as Suf. Yeah. So again, that just makes more sense if the Torah was actually authored back then. So there's that high concentration of Egyptian loanwords. Yeah. There's other things that make the earlier date untenable that I didn't know about at the time I wrote my book. For example, chariots didn't exist in Egypt during the earlier date. They were introduced by the Hyksos, so the Semitic people actually brought horses and chariots with them. So Pharaoh's army having horses and chariots drowning in the Red Sea, that only could have happened during the New Kingdom. Wow. Also, Ramses moved the capital of Egypt to Pi Ramses, which was only a mile and a half away from Avaris. So any other time in Egyptian history, like if the capital was at Thebes, that was like many weeks' journey to get to. It was like hundreds of miles away. But in the story, Moses and the Pharaoh are interacting with each other like overnight. They're sending correspondence instantaneously, and Moses is being summoned. So really, because of that, Pi Ramses is the only place, the only capital of Egypt that there ever could have been this story taking place. And it was really only in use during the New Kingdom, during the Ramesside period. Yeah. So
that's you just taught me a couple of things I didn't know, but
and learning that stuff. I mean, in my books, I had arguing for the Middle Kingdom date. I don't have an answer to that. I'm like consulting them, like, what's the answer? What's the answer? I couldn't find one. I'm like, well, I didn't know that.
Well, like we've mentioned a couple times, right now the winds of the scholarship, and it is
Yeah.
kind of blowing the other direction from where it's been.
Uh-huh.
And also because it came up fairly recently, and Falk had to address it
Yeah.
in the internet realm. Is in the conquest of Joshua. Some of them, I've seen some people say, well, we don't have all these cities, evidence of all these cities being razed and destroyed. And it's like,
Yeah.
the Joshua conquest doesn't even say that they razed and destroyed all the cities.
Yeah, you got to read the text more carefully. Now, because Joshua is an ancient Middle Eastern war text, those do tend to make the victory sound large and grand and mythical. And you can see that all over Egyptian text, Akkadian text, whatever. Whenever a king would win a military victory, he would really make it sound like I utterly destroyed the opponent and I smashed their faces into the ground and I turned their children to dust.
Well,
But in the archaeological record, we
interesting?
find out it wasn't that big of a victory. It was just a mild victory.
What's interesting of that is that's absolutely true in the Middle East, and a lot of the a lot of the documents that or tablets that we have in Egyptians or Assyrians or whomever.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hyperbole and propaganda, but you actually don't even have to go that far back to know that in military history. If you study military history alone, you'll get numbers that are massively inflated all the time. And it's Caesar will massively inflate. You know, I had 6 people to their 430,000 and I won. You know, not that much, but.
We're still doing it today. Like World War II is in living memory, and as the victors, we have elevated World War II into being like this mythic status. We've made so many movies and there's so many documentaries and so many books, and we kind of, as Americans, we've put a real Amerocentric view of the war, like, you know, the world was just falling apart, but then we Americans came and saved the day, and we saved Europe, and we saved the Pacific, we saved the world. And yeah, America did contribute a lot to the victory, obviously, but we're kind of putting the British aside and the Russians aside for Hitler's defeat. Forget those guys. America,
especially the Russians. Especially the Russians in Europe. Now, the U.S. did a lot in the Pacific, but in Europe, it was really the Russians who paid the cost and all that. But there's one historic.
Let me just claim real quick about the Bible, about the Book of Joshua. Though it gives that impression, but I'm not saying that the story is like inaccurate or exaggerated. Because if you look carefully in the text, there's only 3 cities that were commanded to be burned with fire, and that was Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And the rest of them, it was just a war of occupation, just driving out the native population. Because you don't want to burn those cities to the ground, because then you'd have to rebuild the houses and the buildings to live in. So it's easier to just drive them out and then settle yourself down in those those buildings.
Well, and also I was thinking of that whenever I read your blog about this, your latest blog about that, is also it does say that they will take possessions of houses they didn't build and all that. But on the military history point, there's a military historian, I can't remember when he wrote, like 1800s or something, it's a while back, but name's Hans Delbruck.
Yeah.
If you read him, it's actually pretty fascinating. It's a pretty dry read, but he's very critical of the numbers of military campaigns, and he breaks it down so well. But he really breaks down a lot of that inflated numbers, you know. And it's like, yes, Napoleon won, but it wasn't these numbers, you know. And Napoleon was doing it. Military history has always been that way. There's always hyperbole, and especially in victories, concerning the number of combatants and the effect of the victory of total destruction
Yeah.
Well, we drove them off the field, so that's total destruction. Yay, us.
Yeah.
But and so that's definitely a Middle East thing, ancient Middle East thing. But that's a military thing,
Yeah.
period, military history thing.
Yeah.
But we can,
The results from Jericho are promising because there was just an archaeological dig last year, and I cited it in the blog in the sources. So it's generally assumed that Jericho was not destroyed by. It was destroyed, but not by the Israelites, because the destruction layer that was found was dated to 1550 BC, and that doesn't even match with a 1447 BC date for the Exodus. But we're now seeing that cities in that region were actually built and destroyed and rebuilt several times across the centuries. So it's very, very likely that the Joshua destruction happened later after that. So the 1550 destruction happened, and then the city was rebuilt, because we now know it was occupied at the time of Joshua during the late Bronze Age. And Hazor matches the Bible perfectly. The destruction layer falls right in line with the book of Joshua, and we even find that the idols of the citizens of Hazor were decapitated. And normally, with conquest in the Middle East, you didn't destroy a person's gods when you defeated them.
No, you
actually
take it with you.
incorporated those gods into your own, because it's like, well, all the gods live in the divine realm, so we have more gods to add to our pantheon. That's more divine favor. That's more gods to pray to. That increases our chances of blessings. So we can kind of see that tell that the Israelites were conquering, and they were hardcore Yahwists, and they were destroying. And that decapitation isn't something we see anywhere else in the ancient world, but we do see it in the Bible in 1 Samuel, when the Ark of the Covenant is captured and placed in the temple of Dagon in Philistia, and the idol is decapitated by the power of God. So that's really interesting stuff. Now, AI has not really, it's controversial. They found a city they think was AI, but it didn't even exist at the time of Joshua. So there's some debate over whether or not it even really is AI. It's hard to say for sure. But when you look closer, you do see there's more evidence lining up for the conquest narrative. And what can really help determine the problem is actually, instead of archaeology, is anthropology. And so Kenneth Kitchen covered this on the reliability of the Old Testament, that population surveys show that right before 1210 BC, so if we put the Exodus at 1265 or so, within a generation later, the whole countryside exploded and had a population boom. So that does fall right in line with the conquest narrative.
Yeah, I saw that on that latest blog too, and that I can't remember his name, but the other guys, like, a way to explain that was really wild, and it's like, they had just had a lot of temple orgies, and then there's a big baby.
Yeah, that was that's Israel Finkelstein. Yeah, he's a biblical minimalist. I didn't find that. That was made up whole cloth. I didn't find that convincing at all.
Yeah, and like, where do you get that?
Yeah.
but and not just biblical scholarship or biblical archaeology, but a lot of universities have gone more liberal and for several years. And I'm not using liberal as slander, but there's still a cadre of conservative scholars, and often, especially if you're not in it or you don't want to be in it, especially like biblical archaeology or biblical studies, it's real easy to cast off the conservatives as just crackpot people, or people more determined to stick to their statement of faith than speak truthfully about the scholarship. And you got people like Michael Heiser like that. He's a conservative scholar, so but he's not just making things up. He's not just holding firm to his faith despite evidence. And the term faith is a whole different can of worms in that regard. But what's amazing about that charge, though, is one of the first things I did before I even believed or really even started reading the Bible is Jordan Peterson got me to take the Bible seriously. He brought me to a place where I would take the Bible seriously and decided I needed to read it.
Yeah.
Well, he talked about how often it's in the Bible is truth, is to speak the truth. And that was that was like my first Bible study I did. Was I just got a concordance and I just went through and like read all the passages talking about being truthful, and it's like, no matter.
Are you there?
Yeah, we had a little.
Okay, yeah, we had a little hiccup there.
Yeah, I got rural Arkansas internet, so it's not very good.
Okay.
but that was one of the first things that really struck me was how much of a overwhelming, consistent emphasis the Bible puts on truth.
Right.
And it's like you're undone if you're being false. I mean, if you're knowingly being false.
Yeah, and so on that note, when you have atheists on the internet that make fun of the Bible and they say things like, hey, snakes can't talk, I just think, boy, that's dumb. Like, it
is, yeah.
And
yeah.
Like when you listen to Jordan Peterson and you listen to his lectures about the meta-truth and the meaning, I don't see how you could unsee it and still keep looking at the Bible in a stupid way like that. Like this book says there's a talking snake. Huh, snakes can't talk. Like that is so not the point of the story. And like when it comes to archaeology, I mean, I think we can start with the Exodus, and I think we can establish the whole history of Israel. So the outline of the Bible from the Exodus onward is true and can be demonstrated in archaeology. It's really impossible to do that with Abraham.
Yeah.
Because Abraham was a nomadic traveler, and even today, nomadic travelers don't leave any evidence of their existence. They're that good. So, everything before that, I definitely think there's a meaning to the story, and there's deep symbolism. It kind of blurs the line for me because you can't really determine with absolute certainty, like, you know, when and where did Adam and Eve live? How long ago was it? I do like what I lean towards the most is, you know, the Garden of Eden is probably located in where the Persian Gulf is now, because we know that there was a tropical paradise like way back, like before the Ice Age, located there. So I think that's very plausible, and that's my favorite one, but it's almost missing the point to focus on things like that. Like, you know, these stories have such a deep meaning to them. And it's like, that's why it's still here. It's thousands of years old, and we still read it, and we still get that, you know, it speaks to these universal human truths.
Well,
about our relationship with God. And
that's what got me to take the Bible seriously was Jordan Peterson did this Psychology of the Bible series.
Yeah.
And I was like a lot of, I mean, I've found some of my notebooks from 20 years ago, and I wrote a lot of the stuff that Philly J used to still say today, and I'm like, oh my God, did I write that? But Jordan Peterson got me to take it serious because there was a meta-truth being shown. And then my path went through Jonathan Pageau, which he talks about symbology a lot.
Yeah.
The Symbolic World is his YouTube.
Yeah. Great channel, by the way.
I love it, And what I started realizing was it isn't necessarily like literal truth that is so amazing about the Old Testament is the pattern of truth. It's the symbolism of meta-truth, of eternal truths about people, about us, about what we experience, about the world.
Right.
And that's where I really started on my journey. And, you know, it's like Genesis 1, and I don't think that I don't know that I would say that Genesis 1, I don't think the main point of Genesis 1 is to portray a physical creation. Right? I think the Genesis 1 is more about God's purpose for people.
Yeah, and I think we can safely say that Genesis 1 is a liturgical hymn, composed very, very ancient. Like, you can definitely see the relationship between creation and the tabernacle. The way the tabernacle was built and constructed and inaugurated is kind of what God is doing with the cosmos there.
Yeah.
Because you can see how. So people get hung up on the literalness of it says that the sun was created after the plants. How did that happen? And yeah, again, it's like the snake thing. It's like, boy, you're missing the point. Like, that is not, like, if you really look at it, and I think as Christians today, we're missing out if we don't explore this stuff. Like, I think it's an underrepresented aspect of Christianity to go forth in history and like really uncover the context of the ancient world. And like I said, I'm really fascinated by ancient religion and ancient myths. And even if it's not the Bible, I enjoy reading about, the Greek mythology and about the religions of other people, the South Americans, and how they build these mythologies. And it's like there's these ancient universal truths and fables and stories that repeat over and over again. And it's like you learn so much more about the Bible when you look at it in that world and in that context. I don't believe, for example, the South American, like the Mayan mythology is literally true, but it's still fascinating to study. Because, they were people just like us, and they were doing things that the human brain does and formulating stories and myths and, I honestly think like those ancient mythologies were trying to send us a message. It's like, we need to write this down and preserve it so it'll last, for the generations. This is wisdom. This is wisdom people thousands of years from now will need to know.
Well, and what we run afoul of a lot is a sort of presentism where people are hateful of ancient people. It's like, well, they're just stupid and ignorant. They didn't know anything. And it's like, you know what? If you study history, people have been people the world round all the way through time.
Yeah.
They're not, if they were just stupid, then we wouldn't be here because we wouldn't.
And what's funny is if you really look at modern society, you can see some ancient tendencies. So one of the funny examples I've always used is like we look at gladiator battles and we think, man, in ancient Rome, the crowd came and watched people fight with swords and stab each other. Man, they were barbarians, and the crowd was cheering at the bloodshed and the violence. But then we'll watch something like reality TV where people are being humiliated in front of millions of people, and we get kind of the same sick joy out of it. So yeah, we really are still them.
Even the epic fail videos, I think that kind of goes that way too, But and whenever I started reading the Bible, I never really saw Genesis 1 as at least primarily, or I always viewed it through the theological frame as the most important part of it.
Yeah.
And but John Walton was one of the ones that really brought this together for me.
Yeah.
Just before I really read Walton, though, I was reading Genesis 1, and I was like, wait. And just like I had revelation. And it's like, this is the tabernacle. This is God creating the tabernacle and setting up human beings as his priests and representatives on earth. And that's exactly what John Walton talks about in his The Lost World of Genesis. Right. And I think that's the most I think that's the most useful interpretation of Genesis 1.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a great book series, by the way. I have all of the John Walton books. That's like I consider that a must-read.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very eye-opening. I mean, just before I read Walton, I started getting that put together in my head, or having revelation of it. But Walton really helped me to understand it more articulately.
Uh-huh.
And that's what I've gotten a lot from Heiser too. Is not so much that I've learned a lot from Heiser, but he also makes sense of these other pieces over here that I couldn't quite connect. And that was one of the big things for me was whenever I read the Bible, for myself finally.
Mm-hmm.
I sat down to try and let it speak for itself as much as I could. I tried to take my biases and my presuppositions and set them to the side as much as I possibly could, and let the Bible speak for itself. So I would read it charitably and assume that there's a point to it. Right? I read about this, a speaking serpent, and I don't just immediately go, "Oh, okay, of course," but go, "Why? Yeah. Why is there a speaking serping serpent here? What's the point of that?"
And to me, like when atheists say things like, "Yeah, snakes can't talk," it'd almost be like, looking at Aesop's fables and saying, "Well, this story's not true. Rabbits and turtles can't talk." I'm like, yeah, that's missing the point. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a strange literalism that like defies all literature. Whenever people approach the Bible like that, it's like nobody reads any other like literature that way.
Yeah.
Nobody's saying, well, there's not elves, so this Tolkien book is pointless. It's just But people are fascinated by the Lord of the Rings, and they're grabbing onto these actual truths that are exposed through the literature, which is fiction of Tolkien.
That's the irony, that people will dismiss the Bible, but then they'll read like Lord of the Rings, and there's so many of the same things, and they don't even put two and two together that way.
Yeah, they can't. They have this bias against the Bible where they won't approach it with that charity or that clarity, or just to assume that there's a actual point to it all.
Yeah.
But I've always thought that was the most important thing about Genesis 1 was the theological aspect. And so I had someone, it wasn't a bad interaction or anything, but I had someone ask me kind of that. It was a good respectful interaction, but they were asking me, well, how can you believe in talkie donkeys and and stuff like that?
I've gotten that one a few times too.
And it's like, well, you know what? You're getting the cart before the horse, because I didn't start there. I didn't start saying, well, do I believe in talkie donkeys?
Yeah.
Right? I started with, is there a God?
Yeah.
So you got to start, first things first. You don't start at, well, can a serpent talk, or does a donkey talk?
Yeah.
Or you don't start with these big things like that. You start with, is there a God?
Yeah.
And then once you believe there is a God, I mean, there's a lot more things on the table, isn't there?
Yeah. And I think an extraordinary amount of damage has been done, is still being done by Christians who are so literal about the book of Genesis that they believe the earth is 6,000 years old and that humans and dinosaurs lived together. That's doing enormous.
Or even that dinosaurs are a psyop that's just made up. I mean, you get that too.
Yeah, and I hate that things like that are becoming more popular on the internet. Like, I laugh and joke about flat earthers, but until I actually had a bunch confront me on Twitter, and I'm like, what they say is so dumb, I'm speechless. I wasn't prepared to argue with flat earthers. Like, we thought we were going to have flying cars by now. Instead, we're arguing on the internet over whether the earth is flat. And I've run into a few of those dinosaurs weren't real. They were made up by Satan to make people not believe in the Bible.
You got these hard literalist types that like Answers in Genesis. They're like telling people your faith has got to be in the literal interpretation of Genesis 1. And it's like, wait, our faith is Jesus Christ the rock, not Genesis 1 being literally interpreted.
And I personally, I did grow up in a very strong evangelical Christian home, but we were actually old earth creationists still, so we were serious and strict about a lot of things in my family, but I never saw a contradiction between dinosaurs and living millions of years ago and the Bible, because I just always assumed that stuff all took place before the creation account and before Adam and Eve. And so the very first time, I wasn't a teenager until I first heard of young earth creationism, and I see some of those comic books that they put out that have Adam with a pet velociraptor, and a brontosaurus boarding Noah's Ark, and I'm like, what is this? This, I mean, immediately that just seemed silly to me. Like, where are people getting that from? And I had no idea how hardcore people are about it. And I can honestly tell you, like, I've gotten a lot of heat from atheists on like social media, but the heat I've gotten from young Earth creationists rival it. And I've never really even taken a hard stance on it, even though personally I am still old Earth. Yeah. But, I wrote a blog about what is the behemoth from Job? It's not a dinosaur. What is the Leviathan from Job? It's not a dinosaur. And the way young Earth creationists just came out of the woodwork and just were all over me, tearing me apart and calling me an idiot and a heretic and a liberal, and I'm almost still having nightmares about it. It really got under my skin. It was as bad as any time I've run afoul of the atheist internet community.
Well, what I just said about Genesis 1, and some people that there are people out there who would say, well, I'm just some liberal who wants to undo the authority of the Bible, and it's like, no.
They're doing more damage to the authority of the Bible than anyone else does. Because there is a direct pipeline. Yeah. From the heart. You may have noticed this, but the vast majority of angry atheists on the atheist community are former young Earth creationists that grew up in a strict evangelical classroom. Almost all of them, and they still won't accept any old
other
interpretations of the Bible.
Yeah,
they think that we're just committing mental gymnastics to keep protecting the Bible, and I'm like, no. When you really study it in its ancient context, this stuff really does fall into place and make sense. So.
Yeah, and that's a strange one. Yeah, that there really is a pipeline from these hard literalist evangelical circles to online activist atheists.
Yeah,
and there's also a direct pipeline from hard determinist Calvinists to online atheists who still contain their deterministic beliefs.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty easy transition to make from Calvinism to determinism.
yeah, it is actually. I mean, and I can actually understand it. Of course, I'm not a Calvinist, and I don't believe at all in Calvinism. I mean, I'm not saying that they're heretics or anything, but I could see some very hard questions from like determinism and especially double predestination.
Yeah.
That could lead to a fallen or destroyed faith. I mean, I could see definitely how that would work.
Yeah.
And I can see where young Earth creationists, literalists, create a pipeline, because you go off to college and then you're learning. It's very easy because you're being told that you have to believe in this literalist interpretation of Genesis 1 or you're not faithful. And then you go to college, or you go to even public school, and you start learning history or the science and stuff, and it's like, well, this is impossible. But you're placing your faith in the wrong spot.
Yeah. There's a really great book I would recommend. It was actually the first book on apologetics I ever read, and it really summed up what my own personal experience was with atheism and with doubting my own beliefs and my own upbringing. Because, I mean, we all go through that period, and I went through it as well, where the book is called Thank God for Atheists by Timothy Morgan. And it's the subtitle is How the World's Greatest Skeptics Led Me to Faith. So Timothy Morgan was a youth pastor who had, theological degrees, but his youth pastoring ministry was kind of a disaster, and he got really angry with God. So he just decided, I'm going to become an atheist. And he had always protected himself from reading atheists, because he was afraid, or he was protective of his religious upbringing, and he was like, I better stay away from Richard Dawkins and from the atheist writers. It's going to be this groundbreaking stuff that will totally destroy my faith. But when he read it, he was disappointed. It's like he just looked at it and said, this is it. So he read Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. He read Sam Harris, The End of Faith. He went through all of the atheist authors he could find. And he just kept saying, maybe the next book will finally convince me that atheism is true and there's no God. So he would go to Bertrand Russell. He would read Friedrich Nietzsche. And eventually, after like 10 years of this, he just said, I give up. There is a God, because if there wasn't, there'd be a better argument by now. And I kind of went through the same with my own crisis of faith. Like, you know, I grew up in that very strict Christian home, and I was very protected from the other beliefs, like don't ever listen to atheists, or they'll corrupt you, or they'll lead you astray. And, you know, just quote the Bible at him. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. But after going through that period of doubt, it was like all this, you know, this stuff that's like scary, like Richard Dawkins, and there's something mystic about it. Like it's going to unravel my faith. But when I actually did read it, I was like, this is what I've been afraid of all along. These aren't even good arguments. These are like terrible arguments. And I've explored atheism, and I've actually taken it seriously, because I do like to be as non-biased as I can. As a Christian, I will honestly approach atheism and try to study it on its own terms, because I want them to be charitable to us like that. But there's a few atheist philosophers that I do think have given good arguments against God's existence that need to be answered and challenged. But the vast majority of it is just these angry rhetorical atheists like Christopher Hitchens, who are just trying to be inflammatory to gin up their audience and get more book sales. And I experienced that with the atheist community on the internet as well, from the Twitter folks. But you can go ahead.
Rhetoric was definitely Christopher Hitchens' greatest weapon.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is my crisis of faith was actually what led me to Christianity. Yeah. Because I was what I would say a secular humanist overall. And I had a crisis of faith because I started facing the moral argument. And it's like, so I believe that all people are, I wouldn't even say created. I believe all people are equal. I believe all people are deserving of equal dignity, that there are such a thing as human rights. And then I was like, why do I believe that? So I searched for a foundation, right? I searched through logic. I did my own logical and philosophical work. I read logical and philosophical work, and I got to the point where I was like, I couldn't find a solid foundation for that. I mean, you can say that, but you can't logic yourself to it.
Right.
There is no logical argument for universal human rights. I mean, you can say, well, we were compelled as a society to get along, and you don't want to cut your own throat by constantly going behind your back on your neighbor or whatever. And it's like, that doesn't really work. There's no compulsion to that. It's still, there is no, not compulsion is not necessarily the right word. There's no, it doesn't tell you anything. There's no command to your behavior. There is no foundation there. And that's what actually that was my crisis of faith, because I wasn't willing to let it go. I mean, I had this ideal that there was universal human rights, universal human dignity. I wasn't going to let that go. I needed to find something that gave me a foundation of it. And that was another thing I ran into when I read the Bible. It's like, oh, there it is. Yeah. So my crisis of faith actually was into Christianity, not out of, because I was an adult convert. You know, I was like 38, I think, whenever I became finally fully believed in Christ. And I didn't just jump in and say, well, that's what I want to do. I did a lot of study, and like you said, like you were saying, a lot of the arguments against God just didn't hold up. Yeah. A lot of the scientific communicators are not being fully honest in their communications, especially like, say, evolution. Yeah. I'm not against evolution, but the communication of evolution is not accurate.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
it's not.
you see that in a lot of the way these things are presented to the public.
Yeah. And in one of the problems with evolution is it doesn't actually predict anything. That's one of my problems with it. They can't predict anything. They can use it as a good explainer for what's happened, a solid explainer for that, but they can't predict anything in the future of how things are going to be. Except for macroevolution is all right.
Well, and I think for microevolution, it is helpful on the microscopic scale. So because the process happens so fast with bacteria and viruses, you all know what I'm talking about. I do think there's some predictive power, because I knew there was going to be more strains of COVID, and when you talk about the bad ways that science communicates with the general public, like, you can easily explain why during a pandemic a virus mutates into new strains, and the general public is just not getting it. And I'm completely flabbergasted to why the average Joe will say something like, well, first they said it was the Delta variant, now they're saying it was the Omicron variant. They're just making this up as they go. And I'm like, because you can not only look at basic biology, but you can go back to other pandemics like the Spanish flu or smallpox. I mean, or the bubonic plague. Those all came in waves like that, with each new strain being different from the last one.
Well, and with evolution, I'm good with evolution. I'm not anti-evolution or anti-science. I love them both, or I love science. But there's not a good communication on evolution. For one, it's not settled science. What is? But
I mean, I think people look at scientists as like they are the purveyors of truth, and what they say is infallible, and that is not even what science is. I mean, by its basic definition, if you look at philosophy of science, that to me is the best way to approach it to begin with. It's like, study the philosophy of things first. Understand philosophy of science before you try to study science itself. And I guess a lot of people just don't quite process that. So where was I going with that? The thing about science is that it never is settled. There's no such thing as settled science. If it's settled, it's not science, because science is about, and this is the philosophy of science from the beginning, is that it's always apt to change with new data. And to me, like, in the scientific community, they change their minds a lot, and to the general public, they'll interpret that as, well, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. But in reality, in the scientific community, they're used to that, because it's just like, oh, a new study came out that was more thorough and had more exact results. Well, then this is true. And so to me, the changing of your mind like that is a sign of maturity. But I love science too. Really, everything with me, I've always been fascinated with it. But with me, it started with actually Christian apologetics, because I read the atheist arguments. I didn't find them that convincing. So I read Christian apologetics, and that got me fascinated in philosophy, because I was reading about the Kalam argument, about these great philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and I'm like, I've never even studied this stuff before. This is really interesting. It was like a new shiny toy I was playing with, and that actually got me into science. So I got into philosophy first, and then that got me into science, because you got to understand philosophy of science before you can really understand why science makes the determinations that it does, and why it often changes over time. And so from there, I just jumped headfirst to like astronomy and natural history, which I've always been fascinated by. The one that has been my Achilles tendon has been quantum mechanics, because I find that a really, really fascinating field, but it is hard to make sense out of. Like I've read a bunch of books on quantum mechanics, and the thing that's helped me the most is watching YouTube videos. So if you go to like YouTube videos like Arvin Ash or Science Click English, where they have quantum field theory visualized and they have 3D animations that show you what this stuff is. That helps me understand it better than reading it in a book.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the thing about quantum mechanics is nobody nobody fully understands it.
And there's so many different interpretations of it too.
There are indications that point in certain directions, and they're fascinating. And I've tried to follow that. That's one of the things I studied whenever I was coming to faith.
Yeah.
But the atheists, the activist atheists, especially the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the new atheists, they helped me. They helped me become Christian, because whenever I first started considering it, I listened to a lot of debates between a lot of these new atheists and Christians.
Yeah.
And I wasn't convinced by either one.
Yeah.
But what I was convinced of is this new atheist guy over here is a very unhappy person, and I would rather be like that Christian dude over there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had that experience. When I first started posting stuff on Twitter, I learned what a horrible nightmare portal to hell Twitter is. Like, you say something like an inspirational Bible verse, and next thing you know, your notifications are full of atheists laughing at you. You believe in invisible fairies in the sky, and it just got to, like, these people are almost like a cult themselves. Like, and one of the things that atheists, this is why one of the reasons I think atheism is untenable as a position, is that human beings are inherently religious, and we always will be.
Yeah.
And I've read some really fascinating brain science behind this. I got a lot of good books I could recommend on the neurobiological origin of belief. I blogged about it a few times. Like, you really can't have human beings without religion. I mean, religion has not just been an important part of our history, but it's so hardwired in our brain that our brain treats it like it's real. So, like when they've done brain scans of people during, prayer or meditation, or even Buddhist monks doing religious chants or whatever, they monitor the brain activity, and the brain takes this experience as real as if you were being chased by a tiger. Your brain takes that very real as a threat. It takes, religious experience just as seriously. So when you feel like you're being transported into heaven, or you're like in the presence of God, your brain is treating that as real as a phenomenon as if you were in danger being chased by a tiger. And it's really fascinating stuff. It's like, you're not going to have a God-free world. You're not going to have a religion-free world. And we see that. We see that play out in a lot of ways. I would argue that even if you're not religious, religion is crucial to our survival as a species, and we would have gone extinct without it. It's played that much of an important role in human history.
I think so. I mean, I think we still see it working itself out as a deep belief in how people are so captured by politics.
Yeah.
And stuff. People, their experiences with music or with concerts, even the most radical punk has this religious experience, at a punk concert.
Yeah, I mean, people are undergoing
with a bunch of other people.
Like, when you go to the movies, you're undergoing a religious experience. I mean, you're in a dark room, you're with other people, and then, like, there's this big glowing screen that enacts a story in front of you. I mean, that's like, it is the same parts of your brain as religious experience are lighting up when you undergo that, or when you read ancient mythology. I mean, there's a really important thing, like what I said earlier about our ancestors were trying to tell us something. So ancient man was writing stuff down to be preserved for us, to warn us about things and to impart wisdom on us. And I think, that's an integral part of the human experience. When you go back to, like, the Ice Age, you had, the tribal leader, and he was an elderly wise man, and, he had all these hair-raising stories about woolly mammoth hunts, and teaching that to his breathless grandchildren by the campfire. Like, he was teaching them, imparting wisdom to them, so they'd know what to do in case of a woolly mammoth hunt. And that stuff is so ingrained in our brains. Like, And it's interesting about mankind. We're the only animal like that. Like there's no other creature that has anything like that in their brains and their neurological wiring.
And you also see a widespread, consistent similarity in like hallucinogenic experiences. And there's all kinds of things. We see that. I don't think we can get rid of the religious impulse in our minds, and I think it's to our detriment if we try. I think it's destructive. I think you're taking something that's there and going to act itself out.
Yeah.
And
it would almost be like trying to create
it.
a world without music, or a world where storytelling has been banished. What a miserable society that would be. Nobody would want to live in that.
But I think we can see this also in like Romans 5 and 6 is if we don't determine what's in that religious slot, something will put itself in there, and that's the dangerous part.
Yeah.
Because you will have something there.
How atheists act, and I don't mean to stereotype. I'm sure there's atheists out there that are perfectly happy and content and are free to live and let live. I said, those are the types that I can actually listen to and consider their arguments seriously. But the ones that are just so full of anger, like they flood your notifications on Twitter, or like swarms of angry bees, I'm like, who are these people? Where did they come from? What's made all these people so angry? And I don't know. Social media has mostly brought the worst out of humanity.
Oh, there's a lot of that, yeah. But that's where I think we get in the most danger, is because whatever's going to get put there, if you're not conscious of it, it's going to work itself out in your behavior and your actions, and as a society, it's going to work itself out. And that's that leads me to another thing, is one of the reasons I'm really into symbology and symbolism. Because we don't actually have direct access to reality, right? We can't actually directly access what's there.
We're trapped inside of our own skulls, and by our own senses, we're limited to what else is out there that our senses can't detect.
So we don't have actual direct access to physical reality. But also, language itself is symbolic. Mm-hmm. I mean, that how we communicate, by speaking, by writing the words, it's all symbology. I mean, because I say house, and you get an image of something in your head, and it may just be a square box with a triangle on top of it, but you know what that means.
It's not a literal house; it's an archetypal house that occurs in the mind.
It's both. It is both at the same time. It is both. Is that thing, but not that thing. Right. It's a symbol of it. It is part of. It is a house, but it isn't a house. And so I find symbolism fascinating, and I believe that archetypes make sense. I think that we can. I think we can see that. I believe I can see archetypes, and who is it? Joseph Campbell.
Heart of Darkness.
Well, I mean, like, collected all the myths together to find the universal myths.
The hero's journey.
I
just shouted out Heart of Darkness because that's one of the books he wrote. But that is a great book. That is like one of the best books of the 20th century, and it's got all of the themes that you're talking about the hero's journey.
And that's what we can see in the Old Testament, especially, right? We can see it has this pattern of reality that it exposes, and Jordan Peterson was talking about it recently. But like, that's another thing I've always been fascinated about, is we can see patterns in reality. We can see it's like music is math, right? And math actually has explanatory power, but why? How so? Why should it be that math could actually explain anything? It's all abstract. It's not an actual thing.
Yeah.
But math has the ability to expose reality to us.
Well,
Why?
and that's the fascinating thing that it's almost like the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. I think he said that in the end, all things are numbers, and really, he was right. I mean, if you go down to the fundamental layer of reality, numbers don't really exist. Like the number two is not really a thing, but like that there are two things is a real thing, and like that's the language that the universe is built on. Because like if you go down to particles and how we measure the spin of particles, like numbers are like they have a spin value of 0 because they're so abstract they technically don't even exist. So they're like at the bottom of reality. So like the mathematics is the code that the universe is made out of and built out of. And I would argue that by definition, that's instructions that has to come from a pre-existing conscious being. So I think that definitely like the universe is coded instructions that came from a conscious being, a mind, a creator that, is, it's so sometimes it's hard to put into words, actualizing it into existence, sort of.
Well, yeah, but I think that's a real point, because why would reality be so structured that maths would have such a strong explanatory power or exposure of what it is?
Language of the universe.
Yeah, and then you got music, which has this. In music, we have a transcendent experience. Well, music is math too. And it's because whenever we participate in the music, we're participating in the pattern of reality, which is bringing us, I think, into the transcendent, in connection with transcendence.
Yeah,
and I think that's fascinating. I mean, why is it that way? How can it be without a conscience agent organizing everything?
Right. So I don't know what time it's 9 o'clock here in North Carolina, so I'm guessing it must. You're an hour behind, right? I got to get going soon because it's getting late. Yeah. But I'm really loving this conversation. This is like my kind of subject, stuff I eat up. So, do you want to talk about anything else? Was there anything else you had in mind to bring up, or questions you wanted to ask me, or anything?
No, that's pretty interesting. I think we covered a lot of territory there.
Well, we went way out in the weeds with that one, man. But I still love it, though. We started from the archaeological evidence to the Exodus to mathematics being the language of reality, but it's not the destination so much as the journey. So.
Oh yeah, that was a great one. I'm going to mess it up, but that was an incredible statement that Jordan Peterson made recently on Joe Rogan's show. It's something like, I'm going to mess it up. But actual dialogue takes us out of the brute reality and into a transcendent, and makes everything much more. Well, it just takes us into a transcendent realm. It takes us out of the mud, so to speak.
I'm a casual listener of the Joe Rogan podcast. Sometimes he makes me want to tear my hair out and look just like him, because he has the people on there that promote like ancient aliens and all that nonsense. Yeah. But I was sort of like, if you remember just a few weeks ago, Joe Rogan went on this really big tirade about Christianity is ridiculous and it's stupid, and how can anyone believe that? And I think it's
then he had to listen to Peterson.
Yeah, to have Jordan Peterson on there saying all that stuff, and Joe Rogan's just sitting there like dead silent. He's just not saying anything.
Yeah, and then have Jordan Peterson go on there and tell him that the Bible is not only true, it's truer than true, and it's actually the precondition for truth.
Yeah, the precondition for truth. I loved that. That was amazing. Yeah. I'm so glad Jordan Peterson's back from the health problems he was having.
Yeah. And, I think he's right. I think he's got that right.
Yeah.
But it's like, there's a whole nother trail. But that was another thing that I understand. That brought me to Christianity. Is I've always been a lover of history and always studied history.
Yeah.
But whenever Peterson got me convinced to at least give the Bible a fair shake and take it seriously,
Yeah.
I did the same thing with history. I went back and reviewed history. And instead of having my anti-Christian lens on, I tried to see it more clearly, and I could see the foundation of Christianity in Western society. And like I said, the moral argument, I could see Christianity as the value, as the basis of my morals that I was already fully sold on, moral and ethics, and I could see the basis of that in the Bible. I could see the basis of Christianity, and if I'm looking at it fairly, I could see the basis of Christianity in the Western world.
Yeah.
And I believe that Peterson was right in what he was saying, is especially in literature, you can't get English literature without the Bible. I mean,
it's true.
Like, the printing press was made to print Bibles.
The Bible was the first book. It was the book. It was the only book for the longest time.
And whatever you want to say about it, it's still the basis. I mean, it's still the basis of the literature. And I think, if I remember correctly, it literally was the first thing made into a book. Yeah.
In the Old Testament days, it was scrolls, but in the New Testament era, they invented codexes, which was well, the plural term is actually codices. Anyone's out there ready to correct me for that, but so that's how you take a sheet of paper and take several of them and stack them on top of each other and bind them together with a cover. That was the original New Testament. Speaking of which, I know I denounced my book, but I've got a box full of them sitting in the basement I've been trying to get rid of. So if anybody wants to order one, just only a portion of the book is devoted to the archaeological evidence for the Exodus. The rest of it is like commentary and what does the story mean and the kind of stuff we were talking about tonight. So you'll still get good stuff out of that. So I'm going to give myself a shameless plug there. I also wrote a book on the New Testament. It's bringing the New Testament to life. I'm very excited about that. It's going to go into the case for the historical Jesus, for his resurrection, for learning the ministry of Jesus and the things that he did in the context of Judaism at the time, what was going on in the Roman Empire. I've got it completed. I'm going to hopefully have it published soon. So be on the lookout for that.
Yeah. And I definitely recommend that people check out your blog.
Yeah, thank you. Oh I have a blog too. I forgot to mention that. I have the blog. I don't debate atheists. I've never really taken off and gotten as big as Michael Jones or some of the bigger Christian apologetics channels, Cameron Bertuzzi, because I just don't like to argue with people. I don't really do debates. I really just do the blog and write books. I know what people have been telling me, I've got a YouTube channel, but I hate making videos. Every time I do it, I'm just exhausted, and I haven't made a new video in 2 years. But I do have a YouTube channel if you want to check it out. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on all of that. So, hey, thanks for posting the link there. So, I just always figured if people really care what I have to say, I've got a blog and I've written this stuff. I've been writing this blog for since 2015. It's 8 years of weekly blogs. You've got plenty of material there to go read and see what I think about things.
Yep. Well, I definitely encourage people to go check out your blog. I actually linked to one of your blog posts on my pinned tweet about quantum mechanics.
Okay, that works.
And you write a wide range of stuff, and you do good research, and I appreciate your blog, and I recommend everyone check you out. Check out your blog, check out your books, even if you had to renounce part of it. Buy a book.
It's part of the learning process.
Yeah, you're not the first person to ever do that.
Yep.
But, well, Phil, I thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. We've known each other on Twitter for a while now.
Yeah, a while now. This is our first time talking face-to-face.
Yeah, and it's a lot better than texting, even if it's through cameras.
Yeah, I agree. I hope I exceeded your expectations of what my persona would be like.
I tell you, you were actually more effusive than you are in text.
Yeah.
But I appreciate. I had a great time. This is very enjoyable. I'm glad we did this.
Too. Thanks, Ron. This is a great conversation. We got to do it again sometime, real soon.
Yeah, we'll do that. All right. Thanks, Phil.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Good night. God bless.
Good night. God bless.